As the elementary school student said some years ago on January 15th, Happy Martha Luther King Day. I was really appreciative of the opportunity to come and talk about this. 1,000 TV shows is a lot of TV. And I thought maybe I'd let you look behind the scenes just a little bit for just a moment or two as to the genesis of NC Spin, how it all got started. I was at an event one evening in which John Hood was there, and I told him, at the time I was the licensee for Fox 50 television, the Fox 50 TV station here in the Raleigh-Durham market, and I had been doing this dull, one-on-one, talking heads interview show for a couple of years. And I walked out of the studio one night and I said, that was the most boring television show I have ever seen in my life, and I did it. And if I thought it was boring, then what in the world could the viewers have thought? So I was a big fan of the McLaughlin Group show that was on PBS many, many years ago. Some of you remember it. And I happened to be at this event and I saw John. I said, I'm thinking about trying to do a McLaughlin Group show for North Carolina. John's eyes lit up and he said, I think it's a great idea. I thought about it myself. But he said, something that you don't know is that I did an internship with Fred Barnes, who was a regular on the McLaughlin Group. So I know how the show is built, I know how it's formatted, I know how it's run, and if you're really serious about it, I'd be glad to sit down and tell you about how all of this was done. And oh, by the way, if you're serious about doing it, I want to be on the show. And I said, well, that's great. You can represent the right. Now we got to get somebody to represent the left. And both of us almost simultaneously said Chris Fitzsimon. So we met at TK Tripp's restaurant in July of 1998 for lunch. And over a napkin sat down, I wish I still had that napkin, pinned out the basic format for NC Spin. And the fundamentals of the show have been pretty much intact ever since that very first show that aired on September 8th, 1998. The principles, the guiding principles have always been, we're going to have people from more than one perspective, balanced discussion. We call it balanced debate for the Old North State. And we've insisted on that through the years. We always said from the get-go, our job is not to tell you what to think. Our job is to present different sides to issues and trust your intelligence enough to make your own decisions about what is the right and the wrong of issues. And so to that extent, we were a little bit unique insofar as some TV shows are concerned. And then we're Southern ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to act like it. We are not going to yell at each other. We're not going to call each other names. We are not going to talk over top of each other, as so often is the case on a lot of these cable television shows that you see, which leaves you as a viewer trying to figure out who's saying what. I can't understand any of it. And so those have been the basic principles of NC Spin from the very beginning. And oh, by the way, if you're a panelist and you can't follow those basic guidelines, you don't come back. Let me take you backstage just a second. The panelists are asked several weeks in advance to be on the show, with the exception of John and Chris, and it's understood they are going to be on the show. But most of our panelists are fairly busy people, and getting their schedules such that they can come to our tapings requires that we book them several weeks in advance. For 19 years, we recorded our shows on Wednesday nights, which presented some challenges, but Wednesday nights had to be the night because of the fact that we had other TV stations across the state and we had to distribute tapes to them. And we found out fairly early on that if the tape didn't get into master control of the TV station by Friday at lunchtime, it didn't air on the air on Sunday. So Wednesday nights was the deadline for having to air. I keep kind of a clip file of stories all during the week. Potential stories that we might use on the air or on our after-spin topics. And then on Sundays, My wife's a Methodist minister, so I go to the early service, come home after Sunday school, and on Sunday afternoons I sit down and begin putting together the show for the next week. And I'm choosing topics based on three primary ideas. Number one, what's the hottest issue? What's the thing that is the big buzz right now and most important topic in North Carolina? And number two, will it have legs? Will it be a topic come next Sunday when it would air on the air? And then number three, can I get 5 minutes of conversation out of it? There's some good topics, but about 30 seconds is about all I can get. Or I got to do 10 minutes on it. And so 5 minutes is roughly the length of time of the typical segment on NC Spin. So that's the way we are choosing these topics. Now, what happens is that on Monday, sometimes Tuesday morning, but generally on Monday, I send out a script outline to the panelists that are going to be on this week's show. And in the script outline, they will know which topics we have selected for the week. I will show them the introduction that I have written to the topic, and then I will assign each of the panelists what's called a first question. Most of the time, we are television, we have to talk in sound bites, and so I can't afford the luxury of having 2-minute answers to questions. However, on that first question, I do give the panelists a little bit of leeway insofar as taking a little bit more time than normal. We're very unique from the standpoint that we're the only television show in North Carolina that shoots with 4 cameras. Most other television shows are shooting with 2, maybe 3 cameras, but we do 4. And the reason for that is because we want to see a lot of panelist reaction and quick shots back and forth. Let you in on a little secret. It's a television smoke and mirrors kind of illusion to let you believe that there's some motion taking place inside this show, and it's not just a bunch of talking heads. So we do a lot of quick cuts back and forth between the panelists. We shoot in something called limbo lighting, which I get a lot of criticism about, by the way. The fact that the background is so dark, and yet right there at the table where we've got the panelist is so light. The reason for it is I want you paying attention to my panel, not to the set. I want you listening to what they got to say, not thinking about what the rest of the set looks like. We do this show on what's called live on tape, meaning once we start rolling a tape, we don't stop for 28 minutes and 26 seconds, which is the length of our show. And so it is unrehearsed, it is live. We don't know exactly what's going to happen when it happens, but over 1,000 shows, John, there have been a few surprises that have taken place. We've had a few words that were perhaps not appropriate that were said on the show, which got bleeped, by the way.
I'm very sorry for that.
Yeah, and you weren't the one, as you well know, it wasn't you. But at the same time, most of the time, these 1,000 shows, once we start tape, we don't stop until the end of it, which makes it look like it really is kind of a kitchen table discussion that's taking place that you might be participating in. The set before we begin is always very congenial, very friendly. First-timers, I think Rick commented on the fact that the first time he was on the show, he was amazed at just how well everybody got along and the topics of conversation. One rule is you can't talk about the topics before we talk about the topics. So whatever it is that's going to be on the show is verboten prior to the show. But it's a pretty relaxed set. It's a pretty congenial set. And this is the thing that surprises most of our viewers. John Hood and Chris Fitzsimon, while they're not what you would call bosom buddies, they are friends. They're good friends. And the same is true with some of the other people. Becky has commented on the fact that she has differences with some of the panelists that we have on the show, and yet she's developed some close relationships and friendships with them. And that's the whole idea behind what we're trying to do. All right, so let me tell you some things that I think I've learned. First of all, The North Carolina of 2018 is very different from the North Carolina of 1998 when we first started this show. And I could get into a lot of demographics and numbers and so forth like that to demonstrate it, but there's several key things that I think that I want to highlight. First of all is the population shift that has taken place in this state. The growth in the population, we've had almost 700,000 people move to our state over the last 7 years. Of those people, a lot of them are coming in from the north. At the same time, there's a lot of migration taking place from rural to more urban areas. As John pointed out on a recent show, this is something that is historic in North Carolina, not historic from the standpoint that it's always been our history, that people have moved from rural areas to urban areas. But it has also changed the balance of power in our state. It wasn't too many years before we started in 1998 that the political power in North Carolina resided east of I-95. That's not the case today. We're finding that there are more people who are moving in, obviously. If you're a statewide politician, you're going to run for office, you can win about 23, 24 counties in our state, mostly urban counties in our state, and win a statewide election. And don't even have to go to some of these rural counties. I don't think it's politically very smart, but you could do that. The state has become considerably more partisan than it was. I remember the day when my dad served in the assembly back in the 70s. And they were good friends with each other, Republicans and Democrats with one another. Heck, even when we first started NC Spin, it was during the days when Glaxo would throw these big receptions, and so these other companies would throw these big receptions. You'd see Republicans and Democrats there together. They had their arms around each other. They were friendly, they were congenial, they were talking with each other, and they did a lot of business with each other. You don't see that today. The Speaker and the President Pro Tem, well, originally it was the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor, but the Speaker and the President Pro Tem are considered the most powerful politicians in our state, but they will readily tell you they don't have as much power as their predecessors did some years back because the power resides in the caucus. And the caucuses are pretty well fractionalized. And it is very difficult. I remember Tom Tillis one time talking with Tom, and he said, you know, I can't do any more than my caucus will let me do. And I've got these fractions within my caucus that are just absolutely adamant about a subject, and I can't do much more than that. So there's that. One of the things that I think I've learned is that political power is an aphrodisiac. And that certainly should not come as any news item, but we can see it playing out firsthand all over our North Carolina General Assembly. I can remember when Democrats ruled the roost and Republicans were the minority party, and they were yelling and complaining and griping about the fact that the Democrats had too much power, it was in too few hands, and said, you just let us get in charge of things, and it's going to change. We're going to spread the power out. We're going to let local communities have more say in what they do and so forth like that. Well, guess what? They got the power and they didn't. Classic case, redistricting. For all the years, the Republicans complained about the Democrats gerrymandering, and yes, they did gerrymander. When they came into office, they took power. They have turned gerrymandering into an art form, as is obviously being demonstrated and playing out in our court systems right now. The other thing that I would say to you is I don't think the caliber of the people who are in our legislature today are as high as they were back in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. Now, that's not necessarily a commentary on these people. They're good people. They're honorable people. I think they really get elected and run for office because they want to help and they want to do the right thing. But think about it. If, first of all, it's costing you more than $200,000 to run and win a seat for 2 years that pays you $13,000 a year, you got to be wealthy Secondly, if you're running to win a seat, and not only do you serve during the prescribed terms of the legislature, but then you've got all these special sessions. Heck, the 2017 session of the General Assembly still hasn't adjourned. Sine die. And so when you spend the kind of time going to committee meetings, you spend the kind of time that you have to spend in legislative work, you can't hold a job and at the same time serve in the legislature unless you're working for an employer that has a special interest and has legislation that they want to see passed in the legislature. The other thing I think is a big change and something that I have seen taking place is in the media world. Over the last 19 years, it has just been very, very dramatic what's taken place so far as media is in North Carolina. Back in 1998, when we started NC Spin, newspapers were still the king of the hill. They were the ones whose reporters were the ones that were telling you what to do. Now, television was coming up and was beginning to get more important and take more of a role. But I can remember the day when you used to fight for a seat to get a desk in the legislative press room. Today you could fire a cannon in that press room and you wouldn't hurt a soul. There's nobody there. During those days, the newspapers would send only their very best to cover the legislature. The most seasoned reporters that they had were the ones that they sent over there to cover the Capitol and to cover the legislature. And by the way, back many years ago, when the legislature was in session, the News and Observer had a full page every day, which told you about every committee meeting, every action that was taken. Today, you wouldn't even know they're in session, so far as the newspaper is concerned. Today, they've got fewer reporters. They're greener. They don't pay them as much. They are not, quite frankly, as inquisitive. They're not willing to work as hard as reporters used to work. When they used to be assigned to work for a major newspaper or television stations. And there's more pressure on them to produce stories and to produce social media. The mantra is quantity, not quality. Don and I were talking about this a few minutes ago. You don't have the investigative reporting that you used to have, that you used to see so much. Now, newspapers created some of their own problems in that many of them bought and sold and consolidated and took on huge amounts of debt. At the same time, the social media was really ramping up and becoming dominant. And so they've made bad decisions. They're swimming with too much debt, but we haven't hit the bottom yet with newspapers. We saw evidences last week where the News and Observer announced that John Drescher, the managing editor of the News and Observer, is being moved to another position, and they're bringing somebody else in to become sort of a regional editor for all of the papers. But they don't have the influence today. Many of them have gone from being daily to weekly. You're going to see more of that taking place because the newspaper business, the economics are just not good. But broadcast television has also changed pretty dramatically during this period of time. One of the things that's happened during this 19 years is television found out that news was a profit center. And so they have expanded their news coverage so as to be able to run more car ads and furniture store ads, because that's what we've all been clamoring for, right? They also have been hiring lots of unseasoned, untested reporters. Now, we know that that's going to be the case in the Greenville, Washington, Newberns, and Wilmingtons, and some of these smaller TV markets, but in Raleigh, Durham, one of the top 25 markets in the country, we're getting a plethora of journalists coming into this market who really have not had the seasoning that you would want to see. And they are being pressured to turn out more. TV stations have all this airtime they got to fill. What are they going to fill it with? And by the way, they're the most over-consulted profession you have ever seen in your life, and the consultants are telling them, what you got to do is you got to touch people's heartstrings. To heck with the who, what, when, where, why, and how that most of us in the journalism profession were raised and cut our teeth on. We want to touch people's hearts. We want to touch their heartstrings. We want to make them feel something. Well, the other side of it is if you'll watch the first 5 or 6 minutes of a television show today, what do you see? Wrecks, robberies, rapes, murders. If it bleeds, it leads. That's the mantra on local television. If it bleeds, it leads. And so the first 5 minutes or so that you're going to see is going to be pretty much bloody news. Well, at the same time, these same TV stations, which once used to produce public affairs, what we called public affairs shows, have gotten out of that business altogether. In fact, it was fascinating when John and I would go around after we got canceled, would go around and talk to these TV stations and even the cable networks around the state about picking up NC-SPIN and starting to broadcast it. They would tell us immediately, A, we don't have the technology or the space to be able to do this, and number two, we don't know how to do this. We don't do this kind of programming anymore. So what you've had here in the media world is such a dramatic earth shift. Viewers and listeners and readers now can self-select the political philosophy they want to watch. You want to watch Fox News to get the right perspective on the story. You want to watch MSNBC or CNN to get a more left view of the story. And the blogs and the social media have all played a huge role into all of this. And folks, it is fairly obvious to me that there's a lot of folks in this world that weren't raised by the same mamas you and I were raised by. Remember what Mama always said? If you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything. Well, I got to tell you, we're living in a culture today where people can feel like they have permission to be able to say anything about you they want to say, no matter how outrageous, no matter how ugly and mean-spirited, no matter how hateful. They feel like it's perfectly all right to go on Facebook or our website or anybody's website and say anything at all, whether it is true or not. This is a reflection of the highly partisan, uncivil, mean state of society that we are in today. And frankly, it worries me quite a bit so far as the future is concerned. So in that environment, what we've tried to do is present civil, honest, respectful debate with different opinions. And it's all right with me if you watch a John Hood or a Chris Fitzsimon and at the end of a segment say, man, I just don't agree with him. I don't like what he had to say. It's even all right if you say, I don't like him. But to get on a blog, to get on a website, and to call him some of the names, that's why my website, frankly, is what's called a moderated website. I choose which one of the comments are going to go on them and which ones aren't, and it doesn't have anything to do with the political persuasion as much as it does the respectful persuasion of the people that are filling it in. But they talk about panelists. Oh man, some of the comments that I've gotten about some of our panelists. It's really interesting. Conservatives believe we have too many liberals on the show. Liberals feel the other way around. Women believe there are too many men. Minorities are convinced that we don't have enough diversity. Rural viewers don't think we have enough from smaller communities. Young people are totally convinced there aren't enough young people. There are too many old people on our show. And it might surprise you to know I think they're all right. They are correct. But let me tell you why. It is considerably more difficult finding a panelist to be on a show like NC-SPIN than you would imagine. Considerably more difficult. Listen to this. First, you've got to have been around the block long enough to have gotten some experience. not just known facts out of a book, but gotten some experience about what's going on in the state of North Carolina or in politics in our state. Second, you've got to have formed opinions, and you got to be willing to state those opinions. It's no good if you're just taking up one of my panelist chairs and you're not willing to tell me what you think. Third, you've got to be able to articulate those opinions and articulate them fairly briefly. As I said before, this is television. We don't have the luxury of listening to 2-minute, 3-minute, 5-minute responses, although I'll have to tell you when Joe Mavretic responds, it does feel like it's taking him 5 minutes to say something that could be said in 30 seconds. But you've got to be able to speak in these sound bites because otherwise this show just puts you to sleep. Fourth, you can't have a conflict of interest that prevents you. I was talking to Joe just a minute ago now that he's changed jobs about whether or not he could be a panelist on the show anymore or not because he's a registered lobbyist. And it's not a problem so long as that position does not interfere with your being able to state accurately, honestly, and truthfully a position about an issue of North Carolina. Let me show you an example. I cannot get a sitting legislator who will criticize the legislature. I cannot get a sitting member of the Board of Governors who will criticize the Board of Governors or the university. It is very difficult finding people who are willing to speak out on those particular issues. So we have to be very careful with it. Now, they've got to be well informed on a variety of issues because, as I told you a few minutes ago, they don't know until Monday or Tuesday before the taping on Wednesday what the topics are going to be. And if they only have knowledge about one specific area of expertise, and that area of expertise isn't going to be on this week's show, they don't have much to talk about. So they've got to be able to speak on a wide variety of issues. They got to play well with others. We know that there's some panelists that are very collegial and work well. For instance, Joe Mavretic and Howard Lee, very simpatico together. So whenever I have one of them on the show, I'm going to have the other one. They respect each other. They treat each other nicely. Sometimes that doesn't happen if one of them is on individually. And here's the kicker. They don't get paid anything for doing this. So you're going to devote a Wednesday night or a lot of Wednesday nights of your life to come to a television station and sit around a kitchen table with a bunch of folks where you've got all of these criteria and you don't get paid anything for it. It is very difficult finding good panelists. And the one thing I've gotten out of all of this, and I'm very sincere about it, is that I'm not the star of this show. And the panelists have been very kind to me, and others have been very kind to me and given me lots of credit. There are parts of this that I am responsible for, and I recognize that. And candidly, with no undue modesty, I think I'm fairly good at being able to select panelists and select topics and so forth like that. But the stars of this show are the panelists. That's who you tune in to watch. You want to see Chris and John go at it. You want to see Becky and others, Peg O'Connell or whoever, talking to each other and disagreeing with each other, as long as it's done respectfully. And I understand that. My role is to sort of be the traffic cop, to make sure everybody gets a fair amount of airtime. Nobody's dominating it, and it's not being taken off in different directions than what I want it to go in. But I think over the 19 years, we have demonstrated, as Chris Fitzsimon, I think, stated the very first year we were on the air, we can disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that's a pretty important thing, and I think it's something that's needed in today's world. In 1998, when we started this show, I was worried that we were going to run out of stuff to talk about after 6 months. Well, here we are 1,000 shows later, and we haven't. And guess what? An awful lot of the topics that we're talking about, when I go back and look in those early scripts, are the same topics we were talking about in 1998. Oh, they're a little bit different, but they're pretty much the same topics about public schools and budgets and taxes and roads and and so forth like that. But for 19 years, we have, or at least were, trying very hard to present balanced civil discussion from credible sources about North Carolina issues in a very splintered media environment. And candidly, our panelists concur that we think our mission today is as important, or perhaps maybe more important, than it ever was before. And then we got canceled. It came as quite a surprise. It came 3 days before July 4th. When I got the word that we were going to be taken off the air on WRAL beginning September 1st, and that as soon as we completed our 1,000th show on Fox 50, on December 31st, we were coming off the air on Fox 50. Needless to say, this came out of the blue. I was surprised. I was hurt. I was angry. I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics because, frankly, it doesn't serve any purpose at this point in time. And all of us have tried very, very hard to take the high road and to realize how blessed we have been to have a production partner. They haven't charged us a dime for producing a half-hour television show over 19 years. And I found out the hard way what it does cost to produce a half-hour television show. And so they have been very good to us, and they've been very kind to us. We love their crew. They're almost like family with us. But needless to say, it was quite a shock. And so we went around and we talked with all the viable TV stations. John, I ain't no telling how much time John devoted to going with me to talk with these TV stations to find out, would they be interested in carrying the show, and what time might they be willing to air the show? Because that's always been a problem that we've had is the airtime. And what we found out is they didn't have the capability. Several of them said, we like the show, we respect the show, we appreciate the show. Gosh, we'd love to have it if you'd bring it over here to us, already produced. Yeah, we'll air it. We'll find some time for it. But we can't produce it ourselves. So we finally hooked up with Brian Sikora and Kelly McCullum over at UNC TV. And from the day we walked in the door, they got very excited about it. In fact, Kelly McCullum from the get-go has said, you are the gold standard of television talk shows, not only in North Carolina, but perhaps in the southeastern United States. And we'd love to have you on our air. Now, it has taken a long time dealing with university lawyers and PBS guidelines and all that kind of stuff to get contracts signed and get everything lined up. One of the biggest problems is we are now having to pay to produce the show, the cost of production of the show. And it is considerably greater than I would have ever have thought before December. Secondly, we're not going to have, we've formatted the show for 3.5 minutes of commercial airtime each week for our sponsors and 3.5 minutes for the TV stations. It was a barter show. They didn't pay anything for us for it. We gave them airtime in order to carry the show. Now we're going to be limited to 60 seconds of airtime per week. Now you can imagine what that's done so far as the cost to the people who've been supporting our show all through the years. But let me tell you something, without an exception, every single one of them have stayed with us and are going to be with us as we go on to UNC TV. This has never been a particularly profitable venture. I've never taken any money out of it. It's been a labor of love so far as I'm concerned, and fortunately I haven't had to get paid for it. It's going to be interesting to see whether we can make it viable enough to be able to pay our overhead and support everything. But let me tell you the big thing. There's several big points here. Number one, and I see Donna walking around. Am I getting close to time? No. Okay. Several points. Number one, the one thing that I insisted on and the one thing that they finally agreed to was that I am going to have control over who the panelists will be on this show on UNC TV. And the second element was I am going to have control over what topics get mentioned. There are no sacred cows. As you know, UNC TV is owned by the university system. In times past, that meant you couldn't talk badly about the university, and of course they get their funding from the legislature, so you couldn't say bad things about the legislature. Well, that's all off the table. They're saying that we've got free reign to be able to pick the topics, pick the panelists, and as long as I don't get them into lawsuits for libel or slander or some sort of Me Too kinds of problems, I think we're in pretty good shape. I will tell you that it already feels funny. John and Chris and I have talked about this. It already feels funny. We've only been off the air for 2 weeks, knowing what to do on Wednesday nights. I am so used to getting up and putting on a tie and going to that studio and doing that show. We are now going to be taping on Fridays at 11:30 in the morning. Now this is very, very important because there have been lots of times when we're sitting around on Wednesday night and we're talking about something that the legislature is considering, but they're still going to meet on Thursday and sometimes on Friday, and we don't know what the action they're going to take. And on the one hand, we can't let our viewers know that we're not paying attention to this, but on the other hand, we can't tell them what happened because we don't know. And there have been a couple of times when we've gotten caught with our pants down, frankly, because we thought something was going to happen that didn't. But by and large, it's been a situation where we've been able to finesse it most of the time. Now we're going to be in a situation where on Friday at 11:30, we're going to pretty well know what the news is for that week. And by the way, they've got a juggling act because they've got to take this tape at 11:30 and get it ready to go on the air, put closed captioning on it and all this kind of stuff, and get it ready to go on the air at 7:30 that night. And it's going to be interesting, but it's going to be extremely helpful because we are going to be more relevant and more timely than we've ever been before. Furthermore, they are giving us some wonderful airtime. We're going to be on Friday nights at 7:30 and again on Sunday afternoons at 12:30. Great air times. In fact, we come in between Washington Week and what's the other one? Wall Street Week. Yes, Wall Street Week and Washington Week. And so we're nestled in between them. They want to rebuild their public affairs block that PBS and UNC had for so many years, and they're using us as a cornerstone to help in doing that. So most of the panelists are going to be the same, although I will tell you there are a few surprises that we will have as we go on the air. The set is going to be pretty much the way it has looked for the last several years. We're still working up set design and dressing the set. There's some specific issues dealing with UNC TV that we didn't have over at Capitol Broadcasting, and it may take us a few weeks to work that out.
Tom, have you gotten that Thunderdome set that I suggested?
John, we called about that, and it has been retired, as a matter of fact, and cannot be used. So, we're very excited. 1,000 television shows is a lot of TV. And I think I can speak for all of us who've been involved in this by saying it's been a mission, it's been a labor of love, it's been a joy, and it's been an honor to have been invited into your homes on a weekly basis. We believe that the adversity that we saw from the cancellation is like getting a lemon and making lemonade out of it. We think this is going to be even better than what we've had, and our best days are ahead of us. And we hope that you'll make this move with us. And in the process of doing it, tell us when you think we've done something wrong or we haven't done our best. And at the same time, tell us when you think we have done something well. Above all, what I would say in closing these remarks is the same thing I say every week at the end of every show, and that is stay informed and watch out for the spin.